Good day. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, Israel at War, a series featuring weekly programs surrounding the evolving situation in Israel and Gaza, understanding its impact around the world, and sharing action items you can take from wherever you are. Today's program is co-sponsored by Visions of Abraham, a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating a deeper understanding of the Abraham Accords through dialogue and interaction between American Jewish community leaders and the Abraham Accord countries. Since October 7th, conversations about the possibility of peace in the region have become increasingly perilous and hostile. Here to discuss what lies ahead for the region is Yossi Klein Halevi, Senior Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and author of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbors. Moderating today's conversation is AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer Jason Isaacson. After we hear from our guests, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire. Allow me to add my thanks to Yossi Klein Halevi for joining us today and to our programming partner, Visions of Abraham, and specifically its co-founder, Eli Epstein, with whom I've been privileged to consult for many years on efforts to advance Muslim-Jewish understanding and expand the circle of Arab-Israeli peace. I'd like to start by taking note of the optimistic title that we gave to today's discussion, Reimagining an End to the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Optimistic, that is, especially now, if one can assume an ultimate actual resolution of the conflict, rather than the dark alternative of the conflict ending with the obliteration of one or the other party, which is unthinkable. I'm hoping that in our exploration of this difficult topic, we will find some justification for that optimism, despite the horror and tragedy and, yes, the grim determination that are Israel's current realities. I also want to preface our discussion by noting that I returned just yesterday from an AJC visit to 3 Muslim-majority countries where, as shouldn't be surprising, the Palestinian cause, the suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, was the topic of conversation. And those who publicly express sympathy for Israelis and solidarity with the Jewish state do so at their peril. Yossi, again, thank you for joining AJC and Visions of Abraham in today's Advocacy Anywhere session. It's always good to be with you again this time,
and
every time we're together. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, Jason. Thank you.
Thanks, Yossi. So let me dive right in with perhaps what would be the most obvious question. Yossi, it's been said that the atrocities committed by Hamas and other terrorists on October 7th and Israel's massive response have fundamentally reshaped the Israeli-Palestinian agenda. You've studied and written about the conflict extensively. Can you walk us through how assumptions and paradigms have now shifted over the last 11 weeks?
So I think that wherever this conversation goes, we need to preface it by saying that this is a time for tentative speculation. It's not a time for big pronouncements about the future. Everything is obviously has been thrown into acute disarray. And it's quite honestly, Jason, it's hard for me to speak about anything other than a self-referential Israeli experience, because we're so overwhelmed by trauma, by anger, by fear. It's one of those primal Jewish moments. And we're all experiencing it to one extent or another. And so on the one hand, I feel emotionally inadequate to fully conduct this conversation. On the other hand, I feel a certain gratitude to you and AJC for forcing me, for extracting me from that relentlessly self-referential place and trying to look at the wider picture, because we don't live in a self-referential Israeli world, even though it feels that way now. And so thank you for that. I just really had to, in some ways, lay out the emotional terms of where I'm coming from. So what's changed? I'll speak first about the Israeli side and then try to say a few words about the Palestinian side. What has changed on the Israeli side is a shattering of fundamental assumptions that we held about ourselves on October 6th. First of all, we always understood that we're more vulnerable than we appear to be from without. We're the only non-Arab, non-Muslim country for thousands of kilometers around us. We are acutely aware of the fact that our strength comes from our ability to pull together in a spirit of voluntarism. The Israeli army is really, especially the reserves, is a voluntary enterprise. And even though there's a draft, there's still that spirit of voluntarism that defines the Israeli army. And of course, over the last year, that spirit of unity has been unraveling. And so we were more and more aware of our vulnerability, but nothing prepared us for October 7th. And October 7th really shattered the Zionist promise to the Jewish people of creating a safe refuge. Israel in 1976 sent commandos halfway across Africa to rescue 100 Israelis held hostage by hijackers at Entebbe airport. On October 7th, we couldn't save 1,200 of our fellow citizens within the sovereign borders of the Jewish state. And these Jews died, many of them with their hands behind their backs, burned alive in the most grotesque ways that Jews have ever been murdered. And we were helpless. The Israeli army was nowhere to be seen for hours. So the shock of October 7th was a level of vulnerability that we haven't known since 1948. I well remember the weeks before the Six-Day War, 1967. I think that this is a much more acute existential experience. Because in 1967, we were afraid of what might happen. Now we know what has happened. And we're very much in an existential mode. And we also know that if we don't restore our deterrence, our military credibility, which was shattered on October 7th, because our weakest enemy delivered the single most devastating blow in the country's history. If we don't succeed in restoring our military credibility, we don't have a long-term future in this region. If Hamas, if a genocidal regime that did that to the Jewish people is left intact after this war, is left standing, then we lost. And we lost in a way that could signal the beginning of the decline of Israel in the Middle East. And so what you're seeing in Israel today is an extraordinary expression of unity. 90+% of Jewish Israelis support the war and agree that the goal has to be the destruction of the Hamas regime. Now, 90% of Israelis never agree on anything. And the way that we pivoted from the deepest moment of Israeli schism in our history over this last year, literally overnight, to one of the peak moments of national unity, shows that we are really in an existential mode. And a people that is feeling existentially threatened is not in a place to really think of the peace process, a two-state solution. Even Yair Lapid, who reaffirmed his belief in a two-state solution, said, not now. This is not the time. We can't talk about this. And President Herzog, who also, of course, is the former head of the Labor Party, supports a two-state solution, appealed to President Biden not to speak about a two-state solution now. So that's an expression of our emotional state. So if you're asking what's changed, I can only say what's changed at this moment. I don't know what's changed in the long term. But if you think about the last great trauma that Israel experienced, which was the Second Intifada, the 5 years of suicide bombings in the early 2000s, that fundamentally transformed Israeli politics for a generation. The Israeli left virtually disintegrated. And what will happen now, politically, psychologically, spiritually? What is going to happen to an Israel that has just experienced the greatest trauma of our history? What will happen to the younger generation of Israelis for whom this is now their defining moment of Israeliness? This is it. October 7th has now shaped a generation. We don't know how yet, but the imprint is so profound that, and that's all we can say at this moment. We know that something fundamental has changed. We don't know.
And as far as reshaping the thinking of, the aspirations of, the concerns of your Palestinian neighbors, about whom you've written extensively over the years, how does October 7th play into all of that?
In terms of Israeli thinking on the Palestinians?
Palestinian thinking on the Israelis.
So I think that what makes this moment so fraught for both sides is that October 7th triggered Holocaust associations for Israel, and October 8th and all that's followed has triggered Nakba associations for the Palestinians. So both peoples are living in their primal nightmare.
Yeah.
And each side has triggered the primal nightmare of the other. Now, I personally don't like those categories. I don't think that this is a Holocaust moment for us. And I also don't think it's a Nakba moment for the Palestinians. It's not the Holocaust because October 7th was followed by October 8th. We are powerful. We are capable, as we're proving every day to much of the world's chagrin. We are capable of hitting back harder than we received. And by the way, I don't think Hamas anticipated anywhere near the intensity of the Israeli response. You'll remember, Jason, that we were warned before the Israeli land offensive that we're walking into a trap. Well-intentioned friends of Israel said, don't do it. Hamas wants you to go into a trap. There was no trap. And so I don't think that Hamas was prepared for our response. But what happened subsequently has put the Palestinians back in their ultimate victim mode, which of course much of the world is reinforcing that. And my hope is that there will be some Palestinian thinking the morning after, which will go in a different direction. And I think it's high time that Palestinians start asking themselves and their leaders some hard questions. Why is it that every time the Palestinians think they've delivered some major blow to Israel, and then it turns out that Israel is still intact and in some ways stronger than ever, and then the Palestinians go into victim mode? There's a pattern there. That pattern has really been in place since 1948. And my hope is that whatever thinking there is on the Palestinian side now, that might be followed by some realistic, more realistic thinking. And also on our side, Jason, we also, we've been living with the illusion of the status quo since the Second Intifada. There's no such thing as a status quo, because if the country doesn't have a policy on where we want to go, we create a vacuum for that part of Israeli society, which knows exactly where it wants to take us, in this case, the settlers, to move in and to quietly transform the status quo, which is exactly what's been happening with the settlement expansion over the years. And so we also have some hard questions to ask ourselves. There will be no return to a status quo.
When we were last together in person, Yossi, in Jerusalem, less than a month after October 7th, we talked about the loss of faith, and you've just talked about the shattering of trust that would now prevail, certainly for the foreseeable future in Israeli-Palestinian relations. We also talked about the shattering of trust of the Israeli public in institutions of government. But not that the trust, by the way, between Israelis and Palestinians was all that high before October 7th.
Fair to say.
How important is it to try to build or to rebuild trust, to stimulate a sense of interdependence between Israelis and Palestinians if we're ever going to put an end to this conflict?
I lost a friend on October 7th, a woman who I knew growing up in New York. We were active in the same student group. Vivian Silver. She was a well-known peace activist. She was one of the founders of Women Wage Peace. Vivian was, I'd say, considerably to the left of me, but as someone who has been committed to seeking reconciliation with the Palestinians from the center, which is where I sit politically, Vivian was an inspiration for me. And Vivian's death, and it took almost 2 months to identify her body. The assumption was that she was kidnapped until a couple of weeks ago. We just the determination was made only recently that she had been killed on October 7th. And that story resonated widely in Israeli society, but not in a way that I think Vivian would be pleased about. It was seen as a vindication for Israeli skepticism toward an ultimate peace agreement. And Vivian was a tough person. She wasn't sentimental. And she understood exactly what we were up against, but she believed that there was no choice. And even though, as I say, Vivian and I saw things differently, I would say that we saw the road to peace differently. Nevertheless, I'm thinking a lot about her these days and her legacy. And there she was living on the Gaza border. You're living on the Gaza border, you can't have many illusions. And yet she persisted. And because she believed we have no choice. And I believe we have no choice. I also believe we have no choice but to fight this war. And I believe that if there's ever going to be peace, it will only come from a restoration of Israeli military credibility. And that includes, by the way, the countries of the Abraham Accords, which I think it's important to remind ourselves that they sought peace with Israel because we were strong, because we were a bulwark against Iran. If we can't defeat Hamas, that could have repercussions for our relationships long-term with our peace partners in the region. So I believe very much in what was the old slogan, peace through strength. I don't remember whose slogan it was, but that's certainly my camp. But to make peace doesn't only depend on strength. You also need people-to-people relations. And again, I go back to Vivian, who used to drive sick Gazan children from the border to Israeli hospitals. And one can be cynical and say, well, where did that get her? But I'm going to speak to you now as a religious person. I believe that any act of goodwill that's offered with from a place of selflessness resonates far beyond our own limited capacity to do good. And so, in that sense, people-to-people interactions, even on a small scale, can have impacts, and I've seen that in my own life. I've seen it happen over and over again, can have impacts that reverberate beyond our small circles. And so I think we really need multiple tracks. And here I come back to where you began, Jason, with the Abraham Accords and with the work that AJC and our friend Eli Epstein have been doing for years, which is trying to lay the groundwork for a regional peace. Now, I think that in order for there to be peace, we have to think beyond the Israeli-Palestinian bilateral track, because left to our own devices, there's not going to be peace. We have exhausted every argument. We know each other's positions backwards and forwards. What we need is a regional context for a regional problem. You know, in the West, the conflict here is seen as the Israeli-Palestinian war. Now, that's what's playing out right now, but we all know that that's just one phase of a much wider war. There's a Shiite Israeli war. And for most of Israel's existence, it was a Sunni Israeli war. And so a regional conflict requires a regional solution. And that's why I feel that the work that you and Eli have been doing is the only real hope for a long-term agreement.
Thank you, Yossi. So let me go a little deeper into that. For decades, it was an article of faith that Israel's full integration in the Middle East was dependent on its surrendering of land seized in its self-defensive war of 1967, and on the establishment of a Palestinian state with all the conditions that we know well. Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994 reached separate peace agreements with Israel outside of that Arab consensus. In later years, with the withering of the Oslo Accords and after fruitless peace efforts with the Palestinians, Israeli policymakers promoted an outside-in approach, as it was called, positing that peace with Arab states should precede and would help facilitate peace with the Palestinians rather than the other way around. Is that what we're talking about? Is that still viable?
I don't know. I don't know if it was viable before October 7th. I also know that any of the alternatives are even worse than a two-state solution. And I emphasize the word even worse, because a two-state solution in many ways is a nightmare. And I know that that's counterintuitive to how the international community speaks about a two-state solution as an ideal. For me, it's not an ideal. I'm terrified of a two-state solution.
Achieving a two-state solution, or the actuality, the realization of a two-state solution? Is it
the realization of it. I'm terrified of a Palestinian state on the hill directly across from my study where I'm speaking to you now. I'm looking out at the lights of the West Bank. It's 2,000 meters away from here. And I'm terrified of bringing Gaza to the next hill or taking that risk. And most Israelis will tell you if a Palestinian state were created tomorrow, it would most likely turn into another Gaza. And I believe that as well. So we're not speaking about a two-state solution anytime soon. But when I say that I'm terrified of a two-state solution, and I'm terrified of the conditions of two states. This land is too intimate, it's too small. How do you sustain two states, never mind two warring states? But the only worse alternative to that is a one-state non-solution, another Yugoslavia. That hasn't changed. That remains the same reality that it did on October 6th. And I think I think Israelis are going to gradually have several takeaways from October 7th. The first immediate takeaway, which is where we're living in right now, is a kind of emotional response, which is how can we possibly ever risk a Palestinian state on the West Bank while we've just experienced this on our border? But I think a longer term, more a counter conclusion, which doesn't negate that conclusion, but it's parallel to it, is that how do we live in one state with Hamas? Do we want this conflict internalized within Israel, or do we want to deal with it from our borders? Now, the shock of October 7th was our monumental incompetence in keeping the threat at bay across the border. But I still prefer to take the chance of externalizing the conflict, assuming that a Palestinian state will revert to hostility. And I think the odds are better than even, that if we withdraw and there's a Palestinian state, it's not going to lead to peace. It may very well lead to more hostility. Nevertheless, I would prefer to have that hostility externalized than deal with it within my own being.
Wow. Thank you, Yossi. Very complicated and very painful. And I so appreciate your intellectual honesty and your candor in going through all of this with us. I have a few basic questions. First, kind of doubling back to some of what we've been discussing, but in a slightly different way. Is there any conceivable territorial compromise, any overlapping Venn diagram in which sufficient numbers of Israelis and Palestinians can accept the dislocations, the uprooting, the sacrifice of biblical or ancestral legacy that will be required to create a coherent, functional Palestinian state alongside Israel? Or is the Trump peace to prosperity plan of early 2000, you'll recall, which required no Israeli uprooting and would have yielded a sharply diminished Palestinian state, is that plan worth a second look, or is it even still viable?
Look, the Trump plan, I think, is actually seems less absurd from an Israeli perspective than it once did to me. I think that what the Palestinians lost on October 7th is any likelihood of a fully sovereign state without strong Israeli military presence for the duration within that state.
By the way, can I just interrupt you for a second? I have to tell you that one of the meetings that I had in the last week in another country in the region, a very senior, very distinguished individual who said to me and my colleagues, Hamas assassinated Palestine.
Yeah, I think that what Hamas did was destroy any chance of a Palestinian state that is not strongly patrolled and to some extent controlled by the IDF. That's finished. My hope is that we can create some kind of a joint military force, Arab countries, the IDF, and a Palestinian force. But October 7th has now imprinted itself on the consciousness of an entire generation. And I don't think the Palestinians have begun to internalize what they've lost on October 7th. But every time the Palestinian national movement declares war, whether it was 1948 or the Second Intifada or October 7th, the map changes inevitably to the Palestinians' detriment. And that has, to some extent, that's happened now again. So when I first heard the Trump plan, I considered it to be a non-starter. And it would give the Palestinians, I think, about 75% of the land, if I remember correctly, keeping all the settlements in place. And that just seemed to me Israel talking to itself. If I had been a settler, I would have grabbed that plan with both hands, as we say in Hebrew. And today, given the alternative of an endless status quo, which will inevitably lead to annexation, which I consider to be a nightmare for Israel, I'm willing to consider other options. I've been interested in the idea of a confederation for many years. I don't believe that it's a viable possibility for Israel, especially after October 7th. A confederation requires some basis of mutual cooperation, which depends on some basis of trust. After October 7th and October 8th, there will be no trust. The model that I'm thinking about, and I suspect will resonate for more and more Israelis the more distance we get from October 7th, is the idea of separation. Now, if you go back to the Oslo process, the early days of Oslo, there were two Israeli camps within the pro-Oslo wider camp. There was the Shimon Peres New Middle East camp, where we're making peace. The Middle East is going to be the next European Union. And there was the Rabin camp, which is, we're not making peace. The Palestinian national movement has not accepted our legitimacy. Rabin said that then, and it's certainly true now, for all parts of the Palestinian national movement, including the Palestinian Authority. There is no coming to terms with Israel's indigenousness. And so what Rabin said was, we're not making peace. We are trying to separate two peoples that cannot possibly be contained within one state. Now, I think that October 7th also vindicated that argument. So October 7th leaves us with a very complicated legacy. On the one hand, there can't be a Palestinian state on the West Bank because we'd risk duplicating Gaza. On the other hand, there must be a Palestinian state because we must separate from the Palestinians. So that, for me, October 7th for me really is the most extreme concentration, the distillation of what I regard as a centrist approach to the question of a Palestinian state. There must be a Palestinian state, and there can't be a Palestinian state. I don't know where that takes us. But the problem with that position, and here I own up to the centrist dilemma, is that is exactly the mindset, my mindset, that led to the status quo, because we were frozen.
Yeah.
If you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't do anything. Just simply don't do anything. But we now know, and October 7th taught us that as well. There's no such thing as a status quo.
And it just gets harder with each passing year that the problem is left unaddressed. So, okay, my second basic question, Yossi, with the Israeli peace camp now a negligible political factor in Israel, even further disempowered by October 7th, and with Palestinian sentiments further hardened and radicalized by the destruction of Gaza and extremist violence in the West Bank, where is the leadership on both sides that can conceptualize and sell to their respective constituencies a territorial formulation that could end this conflict? Is there a rising generation of Israeli and Palestinian leaders who can deliver on that vision?
I won't speak about Palestinian society because I really don't know enough to say. On our side, I see all kinds of tantalizing possibilities, beginning with the protest movement over the last year, which brought hundreds of thousands of Israelis into the streets and is now leading the civic volunteerism that's stepping in and taking the place of this sublimely incompetent government, whose social services virtually collapsed after October 7th. It's the protest movement that stepped in and galvanized Israeli society. So I see a tremendous energy that the protest movement has unleashed in Israel. A new generation of leadership, I believe, was born on the streets this year. I saw some extraordinary people emerging. You know, many of us were out on the streets literally every week, sometimes a few times a week for the last year. And the commitment that took, the love for Israel that was expressed, there was tremendous anger on the streets, but more than anger, there was love.
And across the political spectrum.
Yes,
and across the religious spectrum.
Yes, yes. But I would say that the protest movement is really, and this is something that I don't think was fully understood in the diaspora. The protest movement was not coming primarily from the Israeli left, but from the center. And so it's the center where I see hope. The left is never going to be able to convince large numbers of Israelis to trust it. I think the left has a place in Israeli society. They're an important catalyst, but it's only the center which regards the Palestinian national movement with deep and appropriate skepticism, which doesn't speak about peace now, which doesn't have a fantasy of Israeli invulnerability. We're so strong we can afford to make peace. The Israeli center has a healthy appreciation of how vulnerable we really are. I think many on the left today, after October 7th, do as well, by the way. But it's the center that has the potential. Whether Benny Gantz can be the leader to take us to the next stage, I don't know. But we also have to get out of the mindset of peace now, of a two-state solution anytime soon. The challenge facing Israel is to gradually shift direction away from where this government has been very quickly pulling us, which is toward a binational state and annexation, and shift direction very slowly toward a place where Israelis can once again begin to consider alternatives.
So thank you. That naturally leads to my next and really final question until we open it up, before we open it up to our audience. Is there a viable, sustainable substitute for a two-state solution? In discussions in the region in recent days that I've had, I've tested a thesis of a long, perhaps a very long germination period toward a Palestinian state, building the institutional foundations and the governing capacity necessary for statehood, keeping statehood as the goal, but not achieving it prematurely. I think that's what I'm hearing from you. That would still leave open, though, the question of the status of hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are living in the West Bank on land Palestinians claim for their envisioned state. But perhaps it would be a start. Or are there other models, other political configurations short of statehood that would work?
Look, from an Israeli perspective, or let's say an Israeli centrist perspective, the idea would be some kind of confederation between Jordan and a quasi-independent Palestinian entity. But Jordan has washed its hands of any possibility of that, and I don't think there's any hope in that direction. I think we're stuck with the with a lack of alternative here to a two-state arrangement. I don't even want to use the term two-state solution. It's a two-state arrangement. And as you very aptly put it, Jason, it's going to have to be a long testing period. That nothing's going to happen overnight. And we're going to need our Arab partners heavily involved. But bear in mind that nothing can really move until this government is replaced. This is not a government that can be a partner for any transformation in the region. And the good news is I believe this government will fall. And I believe that new elections will replace what I regard as simply the worst government in Israel's history, really a desecration of the good name of Israel, with a broad coalition that might resemble some form of a unity government, excluding, of course, the far right, and perhaps excluding the ultra-Orthodox, at least in its first stages. And so I'm actually, I appreciate why you're asking the question. My Israeli attention span is focused mostly on the transformations that we need within Israeli society the morning after the war as a prerequisite for the changes with our relationships with the Palestinians in the region. And I'm much more hopeful about Israel's future today than, and this will sound counterintuitive, than I was on October 6th. This past year was brutal. And I was in a deep, deep depression about how do we get out of a situation where our own government is declaring war against the deepest values of the Israeli ethos. How do we recover from that? How do we ever find commonality again within Israeli society? And October 8th proved that we still have the capacity for unity. And I believe that October 7th definitively ended this terrible experiment of a government that brought together the far right religious fundamentalists and the merely corrupt like Netanyahu.
Yossi, I think I have to add a note of political disclaimer as a nonpartisan organization, but thank you for your observations on this. And now although I do have additional questions, I'd like to open it up for our audience. Claire?
Thanks, Jason. Many are asking about the role of the U.S., so I'm going to try to combine. Given President Biden's popularity in Israel because of his staunch solidarity after October 7th, does his perspective have weight in the current climate? Can he, or under what conditions could he, help end the conflict? And does the United States have influence on the Palestinians?
President Biden is widely revered in Israel. He is certainly one of the most beloved American presidents. And his instincts have been translated into policy. I always wondered that about Biden. We always knew how emotional he was about Israel. And I was wondering how he would act in practice in real time. And he has been simply magnificent. Whatever credit he has on the Israeli side, I imagine he has lost on the Palestinian side. I would think that within parts of the Arab world, certainly within the elites, within the leadership, the fact that Biden has stood so resolutely beside an American ally, frankly, as opposed to how President Obama treated his Middle Eastern allies. I think he's done a reset, and I would guess that there is respect for Biden in the Arab world as well. I don't believe that Biden can broker a peace agreement because there is no peace agreement to be had now. I think we have to get rid of that terminology for the foreseeable future and set for ourselves modest, realistic goals. And there, I think Biden can certainly help.
Thank you, Yossi. Claire?
Thank you. Our next question is from Larry Binak, who says, do you think if the Saudis enter into an agreement with Israel, that will be an impetus for others to line up and have a peaceful relationship with Israel? Are the Saudis the key?
I think they are the key. And the very fact that we're living in a world where the custodians of Mecca and Medina are in an active flirtation with Israel is surrealistic for me. And I mean, in general, this is such a surrealistic moment where parts of the Arab world are prepared to grant Israel legitimacy while we're losing our legitimacy on campuses around the West. I don't know what to make of that. And it's such a strange moment. And I imagine that is just in some ways going to intensify in the coming months and years. So yeah, I think that the Saudis are the key here. I don't believe that they will make a deal with Netanyahu. I don't believe that any Arab leader can afford to make a deal with Netanyahu now. And I don't think the Abraham Accords would have happened now. But if there's a change in government, if there's a change in direction, and again, I don't think the Saudis need a Palestinian state to make peace with Israel, but they need some goodwill, some gesture from Israel. They need to hear that we are committed, at least in principle, to a two-state solution. And that's important for our credibility. And it isn't only a question of public relations. It's a question of how do we see our place in this region? Do we see ourselves as a fortress under permanent siege? And the Israel that I grew up with was very much that, and I accepted that. There was no alternative. Now we live in a very strange kind of twilight zone where on the one hand, we are still very much under siege and under existential threat, and yet there are all of these tantalizing possibilities for peace. And how do you balance that simultaneously? That's the challenge. And it isn't only a policy challenge, it's a psychological challenge.
By the way, if I just should point out that the three countries that normalized relations with Israel in late 2020, excuse me, have all stuck by those agreements. They are not broadcasting expansion of the agreements, but they haven't in any way taken steps to sever the agreements. They've been critical of Israel. They've been supportive of the Palestinian cause in public, but they recognize that Israel has to eliminate the Hamas threat to Israelis and to Palestinians and to the possibility of advancing any kind of a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And the Saudis even played a role in that summit that took place between Organization of Islamic Cooperation and Arab League leaders in sidetracking a resolution that would have advanced the cause of severing those relations. The Saudis stood with the Abraham Accords countries to block that amendment to that resolution. So
extraordinary moment that really needs to be recognized.
It really is something. It's true. Please, Claire, are there additional questions?
Yes. Robert Becker is asking, can any long-term peace agreement occur with the current Iranian regime?
Well, the irony is that the Iranian regime has been one of the main impetuses for the Abraham Accords and for the Saudi-Israeli rapprochement, potential rapprochement. I think the Iranians have been a very positive catalyst, and of course this war was in part an Iranian intention to sabotage those relations. Whether Iran was directly involved in the precise planning of this event or not, I have no doubt that this is the Iranian strategy, and Hamas would not have done this if they didn't feel they had Iranian backing to some extent or other. So, in terms of the region, Iran has been a backhanded blessing for helping to wind down the Sunni-Israeli conflict. At the same time, I think that the question is apt on the Palestinian front. As long as the Palestinian national movement has this fantasy that Israel is going to be destroyed by some outside force, I don't believe that they will have any motive to really try to resolve this conflict. And now Iran has taken the place, the Iranian axis has taken the place of the old Sunni anti-Israel front, which Saudi Arabia once headed. If you think about the Arab oil boycott in 1973, that was Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And so it's extraordinary how the conflict has really inverted in some ways. So I think that we are on our way to the next phase of this war. It may not happen immediately. It may not happen with this government, but I don't believe that we're going to be able to live with Hezbollah on our borders. Hezbollah is an even worse version, a more dangerous version of Hamas for Israel. And ultimately, Iran is hovering over all our borders. Iran has Revolutionary Guard bases in Syria. There are large numbers. I think it's 25,000 Iranian troops in Syria, another 25,000 in Iraq. And so Iran is here. Iran is right here. And that is one of Iran's greatest strategic victories, is to have surrounded Israel, either with proxies and allies or with its actual forces. It has moved its conflict right up to our border. And so I don't believe that this war, and this is not just the Israeli-Hamas war, this is the Iranian-Israeli war, and it will have additional phases. Again, it might not happen immediately, but as this unfolds, inevitably, there will be other stages. And so my hope is that Iran will not survive this conflict. And how that will happen, one can speculate. But I think the question is right, that the greatest obstacle ultimately from without, there are tremendous obstacles within the Palestinian national movement, but the great obstacle from without is.
But let's also be very clear. We're talking about the Iranian regime, not the people of Iran, who may be in an extremely different, very different place. Absolutely.
Iranian regime.
Absolutely. Thank you. Claire, I think maybe there's time for one final question, if you have.
Yes, one more. This is from Jessica Siegel. You started off by talking about trauma and the intense feeling of vulnerability, but is there anything post October 7th that gives you hope about the future, or what a future could look like in the region?
Well, I go back, first of all, to what gives me hope about Israeli society, is that we've rediscovered our capacity for coming together, even under existential threat. I was not at all sure over the course of this last year whether we would be able to come together even under those circumstances. And so this has been deeply reassuring on that level for Israelis. And Israel can only make peace from a place of security and self-confidence. That's been proven over and over again. And Ariel Sharon, Prime Minister Sharon, withdrew from Gaza, dismantled the settlements only after we had defeated the Second Intifada. And so if you look at the pattern of when Israel made peace, withdrew, it always was from a place of strength. A similar argument can be made about the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement. It happened only when Sadat realized that Israel can't be destroyed through war. That if Israel couldn't be destroyed in a surprise attack on two fronts, then the Arab world did not have a chance to regain territory through war. And so Menachem Begin withdrew from Sinai from that place of strength. And what this war is about is reclaiming our sense of basic security. And when we do that, from that place, you will have an Israel that I believe might be better positioned to be open to the advice, to the proposals of our peace partners in the region. And again, I'm not speaking for the moment about the Palestinians. There is zero trust, less than zero trust on both sides. But there is a basis of trust between Israel and parts of the Arab world. And on that basis, we need to conceive of a different future.
Yossi, thank you. AJC will continue to do our part to help build that trust and to then capitalize on that trust to resolve some of these conflicts that we've been discussing for the last hour. And Yossi, I have to thank you once again, and also our partners in Visions of Abraham for allowing us to have this really wide-ranging and extremely informative conversation. Yossi, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you, Jason.
Claire, thanks.
On behalf of American Jewish Committee and Visions of Abraham, thank you both for taking part in today's webinar, and thank you to our global audience for tuning in. To stay up to date on the evolving situation, make sure to follow AJC on social media at AJC Global. You can also follow Visions of Abraham on X at Visions of Abraham. Our hearts are in Israel today and every day. I'm Yisrael Chai. Thank you and goodbye.